Hi, so I want to talk about New York City. I've been always asked, what is it about New York City that is special? What is about New York City that makes it special? I think there are many ways that New York City is special. And for different people, it means different things. Some people come to New York City to buy an apartment for investment purposes. They come to shop, to enjoy fine dining, to stroll, to have some fun. Some people come to New York City for fashion. People come to New York City for all kinds of reasons, and there is something for everyone. But I have reflected personally on what currently excites me about New York City. It has been different things for me depending on the timeline. Initially, I came for the galleries and, of course, for the intense art culture. But I gradually realized that I'm not as interested in culture that sits in rooms. It's fascinating. I could go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I could go to MoMA. I could go to any gallery in Chelsea, and I could have a great time looking at the best art in the world. But I'm simply no longer interested in art that just sits in rooms. I have grown to love the New York City street culture. And to me, that includes many things. It's an enormous canvas that is constantly being weaved, and it's constantly changing, and it's a dragon, it's a star beast, it's a phoenix, it's everything. New York City street culture is extremely intense. It can't be controlled, it can't be replicated. It's a living and breathing thing. Let's start with graffiti. New York City graffiti are everywhere, and they're absolutely fascinating, and they weave into the fabric of the city, in and out of the architecture. From the really big graffiti in Brooklyn to the tiny little signs that you would see on lampposts, on traffic light posts, on street signs. When you wait for the light to change, just look at the tiny graffiti that are everywhere. And there are all these little messages. There are also big messages that are beaming at you. There is also the street music culture. And of course, New York City has an enormous tradition in music. And that music, of course, spills into the streets. Musicians are constantly playing music on the street, entertaining the public, and there are a variety of musicians that play on the street, from professionals to students to self-taught musicians. They play all kinds of instruments from probably very special violins to basically buckets. And it's a constant cacophony of sounds and music. There's also, of course, performance. And I'm not talking about just art performance, and I'm talking about people expressing themselves using their bodies on the street, where it doesn't matter, they may be just doing a little performance for money, maybe they're just kind of getting attention by doing some stunts, dancing. Of course, dancing is big in New York City. People move their bodies all the time, with or without music. Of course, often with music in Central Park, but if you notice on the street, I mean, people perform all the time for a variety of reasons. And I have to include in that people's fashion. And the way people dress is part performance, art, self-expression. So people's dress and attire is also part of New York City intense street culture. People dress up so they could be seen, and they like how they look. People dress up and they use their dress to express themselves. And there are actually a lot of people who dress really extravagantly in New York City, and they go out to be seen and noticed by people. Some of those extravagantly dressed people have a thing. If you regularly go to events in New York City, you will notice the guy with the tie that he always decorates in really wild ways. There are people that use really wild dress to get attention, but that's a form of art. It's an expression, and it's all weaving into the culture. These people on the street, they go to public events also. Of course, also part of the street culture is skateboarding and all the kind of rapid movement and skateboard art and all kinds of boarding and almost acrobatics. If you go on the subway, you will definitely witness acrobatics. People want to express themselves with their bodies, so they use the subway like a gym. And they want to flaunt their great bodies. And this is also part of the street culture. And of course, also the storefronts. Storefronts are also a massive portion of street culture. Storefronts are really nicely decorated. Many great shops have very, very shiny facades, and they constantly beam messages to people like, oh, we are so special. We sell all kinds of shiny crystals, shiny watches and bags. That's also, it's just all this music, graffiti, storefronts, people moving, and people's dress. Everything's kind of weaving into the tapestry. Another object that I personally love, but is a big nuisance to a lot of people, but again, it's a very human thing, is the garbage in New York City. New York City doesn't have back alleys, so all the garbage is on the streets. And while it's smelly and I'm not in love of jumping over it, I could see in the garbage the lives of people. So you pass by these objects that have come down from the towers where people were living their lives someplace in an apartment up there. in living rooms and kitchens, and then they dismantle all these objects, and these objects come down on the street level and they become a display of someone's life. And I've always been interested and reflected on the garbage and the objects that come from these towers, and these people who have handled these objects, and they have had good lives, and all of a sudden they're discarded on the street and they smell it, so they become refuse. But for me, they're very interesting, and they're part of the active life of the city. So to continue on that subject of garbage, there's so many broken things in New York City that have become kind of part of life in the city, just like, autumn leaves become part of the forest. At the same time, the garbage in New York City, all the abandoned stuff, become part of the kind of New York City tapestry. For example, you will notice all these ATM machines that have been kind of broken down, and they become these art objects covered in graffiti, covered in all kinds of stains and stickers, and they become some sort of ATM mummies. They become covered in all this city stuff, and they become different objects. They become art objects, in my opinion. Also, some abandoned storefronts, derelict. They're also very interesting. Each storefront is derelict in their own way, kind of a bit haunted, sitting alone in this big city. Another aspect of street culture is street signs. If you notice just the amount of signs there are in New York City, street signs and all kind of ads. Of course, you will notice that on Times Square, it's the most, of course, obvious. But on every street, there is like a great amount of all kinds of signs, all kinds of neon and banners and things basically beaming at you from the street signs telling you which street you're on to the traffic light. So there's an enormous cacophony of street signs beaming information. You know how they represent future cities with all these like holograms of stuff, but New York City has all these holograms, so to speak, already. They're getting beamed at your brain all the time, like neons and blinking and street signs telling you to go and stop and all that. So it has always been kind of strange for me, knowing that people come to New York City to go to a theater. People go to a big room, basically, buy very expensive tickets to go to a room, sit in a chair, and look at people pretend to be stuff, and like made up things. When I believe that the greatest theater in the world is the New York City street, and all you have to do is sit on a corner and start watching. Start people watching, start paying attention to the entire circus that's going on around you. And, it's totally free, and you're going to be very, very much entertained. All you have to do is just open your eyes, look, just be quiet off your phone, and just look, just feel, smell, feel with your body, and just breathe in the dragon that's New York City streets.